has only 3 women out of 10 members, or that at the special procedure system, there are still 8 mandates that have never been held by a woman. Treaty bodies and the representation is a reality that recently led the High Commissioner for Human Rights to call on states to increase efforts to achieve gender parity in the treaty bodies in 2024. At GQUAL, we believe that to change the representation of women in international justice, advocacy alone is not sufficient. Because even if we can make gains by raising awareness, those gains are hardly sustainable. Thus, our strategy has been to identify and address the structural obstacles that prevent women from acceding international positions on an equal footing and maintaining equal representation as a matter of law. To implement this strategy, we have focused mostly on 2 different approaches. First, collecting and updating data, because women membership in decision-making institutions, whether at the state or international level, is measurable, and showing where states and international decision-making bodies stand in terms of gender equality provides a baseline against which to measure progress towards parity. And second, underlining that the claim to women's equal representation in international decision-making is not an aspiration, but that this claim is rooted on the international obligation to respect women's right to equality as provided in key provisions of international human rights treaties, especially the CEDAW Convention, and standards that have been enriched by practices developed by key international bodies such as the CEDAW Committee and the Working Group on the Issue of Discrimination Against Women and Girls. It is in this context that the GQUAL campaign has researched and produced 2 reports. One analyzing the trends, obstacles, and good practices and recommendations regarding women participation in political and public life, and the other one analyzing the CEDAW Committee's reporting practices and trends regarding Article 8 of the CEDAW Convention. These papers are essential to inform policies and measures, but also to identify gaps and/or opportunities to develop the right of women to equal participation in international decision-making further. A process that, as we probably all know, the CEDAW Committee is undertaking through the development of a new general recommendation on the issue. But let me now share some conclusions on the working group report, which, as I said, focuses on the obstacles, trends, and good practices identified by this body in its thematic and country reports regarding women participation in political and private and public life. Since the working group understands public participation broadly, including participation at the global level, the conclusions reached in its reports are relevant to identify and reflect upon the reasons that prevent women from being nominated and elected in international decision-making bodies. Some of the findings of the report identify and document the root causes that prevent women participation in public and political life, including discriminatory social, cultural, economic, institutional, and religious norms and practices, stereotypes of women as not being as capable as men to participate in public and political life, unequal division of labor between women and men in the family, multiple and intersecting forms of discrimination. Another essential feature of the practice of the working group is its understanding that parity is the measure of equality between women and men, and that parity then is the measure to assess whether states have complied with the international obligations to ensure women participation and public participation without discrimination. The working group has also underlined that parity laws or quotas are good practices to address the lack of women participation and to ensure representation of women in public and political bodies. These parameters are essential to enrich the drafting of the CEDAW general recommendation, but are also essential for the working group to implement the recommendations issued by the Advisory Committee of the Human Rights Council. In regard to the CEDAW report, I just want to indicate some of the findings that we have identified. Number one, as you all know, Article 8, the report is based on Article 8 because there is consensus that this provision enshrines the state obligations to ensure women's equal representation in international decision-making. Our conclusions share the views that Article 8 has played a comparative minor role in the work of the committee, even though we acknowledge that some of the findings of the committee regarding Article 7 concerning women participation in political and public life would be and could apply to, by extension to the areas covered by Article 8 as well. We have identified that given the specific system of reporting adopted by the CEDAW committee, where states have been using the simplified reporting procedure, has resulted in a gap, both in terms of reporting by states and also in the observations and recommendations by the committee. In some of the over 100 reports adopted under Article 18 of the CEDAW Convention that we reviewed, approximately 1/10 of them contain information specifically referring to Article 8. And whenever that information is contained, it addresses largely information with respect to women's representation of their governments as part of their foreign services, but there is no information on nomination and appointment of women to other international bodies, including international tribunals or other multilateral fora. So I want to conclude that the committee now has a renewed opportunity to advance and elucidate on the interpretation of Article 8 regarding women's equal participation in international decision-making bodies as it embarks in the drafted of the new general recommendation. And GQUAL, we expect to follow this process closely as we continue to uphold the need to address structural obstacles to the equal representation of women in international decision-making processes and bodies. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Claudia, and for sharing with us this valuable work conducted by GQUAL, looking into the two key actors mechanism in this international human rights system of the United Nations, focusing on women's rights. Thank you. Now I would like to welcome our four panelists. I will first pass the floor to Madame Nicole Amelin, who was a former French parliamentarian and is a longtime member of the CEDAW committee. She is currently leading the CEDAW committee's work on the general recommendation number 40 on women's equal and inclusive participation in decision-making system. Nicole, let me ask you this question. Taking into account the preliminary conclusions in the GQUAL paper, as highlighted just now by Claudia, how do you envision that the future general recommendation of CEDAW will strengthen women's right to equal representation in international decision-making and help to better define states' legal obligations under Article 8 of the CEDAW Convention? Nicole, you have the floor.
Thank you.
You need to take the earphone in the room.
I hope that you hear me well. And first of all, I would like to thank you for this excellent introduction. And let me greet first on behalf of the CEDAW committee, all the participants and the states co-hosting this wonderful event. It is the best encouragement for our work, and I'm very, very grateful. Thank you to GQUAL. GQUAL is on board, of course, of this GR, and we are very happy with that. We are totally on the same line, and we consider that in the context of the celebration of the Universal Declaration of on Human Rights, we cannot accept anymore this de facto exclusion of women from this system of decision at all levels, national as well as international. Of course, it is a major violation of the rights of women and girls, but it is also a structural barrier, as you said it, to the 2030 agenda. And my conviction, and the CEDAW is on the same line, is now we have not only to rebuild better, but we have to rebuild differently. And parity is the key lever of change. And we need this change of paradigm at all levels. It's the reason why the GR has a systemic approach, a global approach, because whatever the measures, whatever the success stories, if there is no global impetus, I think that we cannot reach the goal. And the goal is parity by 2030. The GR has main objectives. First, to create a new legal and constitutional framework on parity. It means this objective to deliver the promise made and constantly reiterate since Beijing, the resolution 1325. And we observe, and it is a very good point, a very main point, that in the international system, there is a lack, a gap, very alarming about the capacity of women to decide, not only for themselves, but for the world. And whatever the field, it can be the trade agreements, the international fora, but also peace negotiations and international delegations. We observe a lack of women and capacity to not only to be there, but to decide. And it's the reason why we think that we need three words, key words. First, acceleration. And the GR is going to provide a very, very concrete operational roadmap based, as it has been said, on Article 7 and 8, but not only, on all articles of the convention, because parity can be the lever of acceleration of the status of women all over the world. And secondly, we need innovation. Innovation means new concept. It can be also the idea to take advantage of emerging system of governance, including in innovative sectors as AI, which, how can I say that, which accelerate a form of obsolescence of the patriarchal structures. So it's very important to take on board this new context, because, as you said it, parity is a response to the challenges that we face nowadays: migration, peace and conflicts, and climate change, but also digital transition. So we have to take on board new initiative and new concept. Feminist diplomacy can be one of them, because we have to precise the content, but it's very interesting to see how women can not only decide for themselves, but in the framework of aid development policies, for instance. And we think that today we observe that it's not the case. Women are not only in the design of these policies, but just as beneficiaries or victims. And we have to move from victims to leaders at this level. And I would like to say, to finish, that we have, of course, the power to act, because this GR provide a legal framework linked to the CEDAW Convention, which is, I remind it, the unique binding instrument in the world on equality between men and women, ratified by 189 states. And so it's very important to have also the mobilization of the states. And I'm very happy with that, because today we have 50 states on board, and I invite all, of course, the majority of states to support this GR, together with IPU, UN Women, and of course NGOs. And but we have the will to integrate, of course, the monitoring of this important part of the CEDAW Convention into the reporting exercise. Maybe more than that, we can propose a global partnership for parity in the world. It could be very important. And we can also make parity a norm and a structural parameter of the new architecture for the future. It will be probably the most refreshed impetus that we can put on the table for the time. But all the topics put on the table in the introduction are, of course, main points for us: fight against all forms of violences, a new chain of values also founded on parity inclusiveness, because we think about minorities and groups exposed to multiple discrimination. And we think also to young generations and education for empowerment. So there is a list of not only good practice, but smart approach, because we need to convince that it is the best way to build a new world, and maybe to move from no one behind to bring everyone along. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Nicole, and for sharing with us this exciting project of developing this general recommendation. And we felt the enthusiasm that you bring to the room. And of course, all of us in partnership, we look forward to accompany you and to contribute to this important normative development process. Thank you. Now I would like to turn to Professor Dorothy Estrada, who is the chairperson of the UN Working Group on Discrimination Against Women and Girls. Dorothy, based on the work of the working group and the findings shared by Claudia in the opening, what do you think are some of the areas where the scope of the right to equal representation in international decision-making could still be developed or clarified, and how can the work of the working group contribute to this? Dorothy, you have the floor.
Thank you so much, Hannah. Thank you very much to organizers and co-organizers, which I won't mention one by one for the sake of time. I do want to give a special gratitude to Hannah Wu, of course, very close to the history of the Working Group on Discrimination Against Women and Girls. Muchísimas gracias a los organizadores. And on behalf of the Working Group on Discrimination Against Women and Girls, to address the question, I would say that there are three broad challenges that still remain, or we could group the obstacles that still have to be tackled and issues which have to be clarified in three areas. One is, as Professor Claudia Martin mentioned, thinking that gender parity is the ultimate indicator of gender equality, also as Ms. Nicola Melin was saying in terms of the structural importance that this has, is that in terms of political participation, we know that quotas, temporary special measures, even the exigence of gender parity as such, 50-50% of representation, are measures to accelerate progress, to make effective the right of women to equal representation and participation. Still, one could explore more how that can be realized when we see that diplomatic services are composed in many countries by a majority of men. This obviously impacts in terms of the selection of candidates, of women candidates, including in special procedures and treaty bodies. So this is one aspect where I think these temporary special measures could be explored further. Some countries have adopted them, but I think it's an issue where we see how the national development of this has an impact in international decision-making, as was signaled precisely, first of all, in the composition of these bodies. Secondly, I think that, and based on the work of the working group, we see how barriers in terms of discrimination against women and girls, not only in what is most evidently public and political life, but also in all spheres of life, economic and social participation in cultural values and how they are expressed, have an impact in the way women can or cannot reach international decision making. So in this sense, apart from addressing, as has been said, Articles 7 and 8 of CEDAW, the working group has developed shining a spotlight also on Article 5 of CEDAW concerning the obligation of state parties to eliminate gendered stereotypes of the roles that men and women, girls and boys should play in society, to actually eliminate discrimination and allow for the free development of women's and girls' rights. So in this sense, if we think of eliminating cultural barriers, patriarchal values, I think we still have to explore more how discrimination and all of these other areas of life are ultimately impacting women's and girls' political representation, or the right in general to equal representation. And here we have the example of the recent country visit that the working group carried out to Malta. Just on Friday, we issued the end of mission statement, where precisely we note how, despite very significant progress, which is to be celebrated, there are also still patriarchal values, for example, in terms of the limitations of how it is seen that women are limited as to their role and their capacity to lead, that actually, even with a system that has allowed for quotas for the legislative body, we see how those cultural values actually place an obstacle to women's participation. And this is something the working group has signaled, using international human rights law to shine light on this. In this second area of the interconnection with other spheres of life and cultural barriers, we still have to pay attention to, I think, two basic groups of women and girls. One is minority women and girls, women, for instance, of ethnic minorities, of religious minorities, indigenous women, women living in poverty. And are we really creating the infrastructure and the enabling environment, as Article 28 of Universal Declaration of Human Rights says, for these women to realize their right to equal representation? And another group is girls and young women. The working group published in 2022 its annual report precisely on activism of girls and young women, and how, under international human rights law, including in the UN, we would also have an obligation as states and stakeholders to allow for further participation of girls, for listening to them, to young women, for allowing for financial aid, to really listen and to allow girls and young women to participate and enter in decision making. And third and last challenge is women in international decision making bodies in terms of economic policy and decision making. If we think of women's participation, for instance, in the World Bank, in the IMF decision making bodies, and how this comes also from national decision making processes, there is an issue where we think there is more to be explored. The working group has said so in its latest report, presented just 3 weeks ago there at the Human Rights Council, The Gendered Inequalities of Poverty, Feminist and Human Rights-Based Approaches, where we think this is an area where we also have to explore more, not only the traditional political decision-making bodies, but also what is happening in the economic arena, because there are clear gendered impacts on women and girls by the decisions of these bodies. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Dorothy. And thanks to the very important work that has been conducted by the working group over more than a decade of its existence. And it's such an important mandate that look at the root causes and the broad range of issues confronting women's and girls' life. And we will continue to look to the working group for guidance and support. Thanks again. So I will now turn to our third panelist, Ms. Patricia GQUAL, who is a member of the United Nations International Law Commission. The question to you, Patricia, is the International Law Commission is a key UN body dedicated to the development and codification of international law. Women have been historically underrepresented. Currently, the Commission has 5 women out of a total of 34 members. How would you describe this situation and the impact it has on the mandate of the Commission? What could states, the United Nations, and the Law Commission do to address this situation? Patricia, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Anne. And then let me just say briefly, without dispensing with all the niceties, that it's a great pleasure to be here at this event today. Not only because I've in the past already participated in a GQUAL event a few years ago, but also because it seems that we're not yet there in changing the picture in international law. And in fact, the International Law Commission is a very bad example. And so I think we need to talk about it and we need to work on it. And so, as you said, the statistics are bad. And I had a very good colleague who said statistics are a girl's best friend. And so it's very good to say the numbers. And as you said, we are currently 5 members out of 34 men, 34 members in total. But if we look in the almost 75 years of existence of the Commission, we have been 10 women out of 250 members. So I think it's probably ranks even worse than the International Court of Justice and the other UN treaty bodies. So this has been an historical imbalance in terms of gender parity in the International Law Commission. The first 2 women who were elected, the Commission had been created in 1947, and its first session was 1948. The first 2 women that were elected were in 2001. So it took quite a long time for the first women to be elected. It also took quite a long time for a first woman to be president, which happened about 10 years ago. And this year I'm happy to report, and that's something that we can do also playing a bit out of the box and being creative, that this year I'm happy and very honored to be chair of the Commission, but I'm not the only one. So we've split the chair because there was an opportunity to have 2 women chair. And instead of doing the traditional thing, which would be just having 1 chair, because 2 women from the Western European and Others group, my very dear colleague Nilüfer Oral from Turkey, and myself, because of the way we do the rotation of the chairs and seniority in the regional groups, we were both in the same position. So we said, why don't we split the chair? And with this, we tripled the number of presidents, of chairs of the International Law Commission. So in 1 year, we tripled the number of chairs in the International Law Commission. So thinking a little bit out of the box, it's probably a way to address these issues. It's, of course, for statistics, but I think it's also a solution that would only work because it was 2 women involved. Maybe if it was 2 men, they would not split the chair. And of course, there would be no need for that. But so to answer your question, I think it does affect our work. In one first point, I think the question of legitimacy. I think that's the most important thing. How can you have a body that was created by the UN General Assembly that has this fundamental mandate of promoting development of international law and codification of international law, and where you have an historical imbalance of women representation? So that's clearly an issue of legitimacy of the organ. And also, I would think that the working methods, in a way, also have an impact. The fact that we are always a very small number of women. So first we had 2, then we had 3. Last mandate we had 4, and now we have 5, which is the highest number ever of women in the Commission. And just also a side comment and an anecdotal comment. As the chair, and because we're a new commission starting this year, I asked the secretariat to organize for a photograph for our website, because it's always something that, people that look at the website, they see the photo and they immediately see that there is a very few number of women in the commission. So we decided to put all the 5 women together at the front of the photo to make it seem that we're a bit more than we are, just also, but to draw attention to that. But so I think that there's also an impact not only in the legitimacy, but also in the working methods. I think the fact that we saw that last mandate we were 4 and now we are 5, it has instituted a more collaborative approach. We've been working also in different ways, and women have been involved in that. For example, I'm co-chair of a working group or a study group on sea level rise in relation to international law, and it's 5 of us and including 2 women. And normally the approach would be special rapporteurs, very individual members. So I think the working methods also more collaborative, less competitive. I think it has also an impact. And then probably also on the topics that we work on and the approach to the topics, because a lot of times we're missing that gender perspective. And we hear many times when there are gender sensitive issues, of course, in our work, we have a lot of issues that are very legal and abstract and theoretical, but then we also have, for example, we're discussing currently the impact of teachings as a source of international law, as a subsidiary means. And of course, there was a proposal that came from the women, including myself, to say that when we look at academic teachings, we have to look at the geographical representation, the different legal systems, but we also have to look at gender. Because most academic writings quoted by the International Law Commission itself and by the International Court of Justice are from white European men. And so the need to have different voices, to have different inputs, to have different perspectives, I think it's also very important. And so this issue of the topics and the bringing a gender-sensitive perspective to the sources, but also to the substantive issues is very important. What can we do to change this? So we've started, I think, in the last commission to become more aware and to feel the need to speak out about these issues. And we had a side event when we had the 70th anniversary of the commission in New York, and I think Shara was there. And we had, I mean, a very catchy title for the event, which was 7 Women in 70 Years. That was the statistics at the time. And so everybody came to the event, everybody was speaking to the event, and we even said, well, we don't even need to organize it anymore because we've already made the point, just with the numbers. But I think there are ideas because the problem, the source in the problem, so we are elected by the General Assembly. Member states nominate candidates, and it's the General Assembly that makes the decision by an election every 5 years. And the source of the problem, it's not so much in states not electing women, it's states not putting forward women candidates. So the maximum women candidates we had was this last election, we had 8 women candidates. That was the maximum ever. Normally you have about 60 men candidates. Only 8 women, 5 were elected. So I think the main point, and we are even considering this year in our report to put something more specific, saying that states should consider when putting forward candidates that need for gender balance in the commission. And this is what we can do as individual members, speak about it, organize events, draw attention. The commission can also go a step forward and put something in the report to call member states' attention. And I think that event that we did some years ago already had a bit of an impact because for the first time, I mean, the previous election we had 4 candidates and the next election we had 8, so doubling. That's a lot. But perhaps the most radical step, but that has to come from the initiative from member states, would be to change our statute. Because since we're an organization created after the Second World War, we have a statute from 1947, and there is no requirement of gender parity or gender representation in the statute. So there's only the requirement of the representation of the various forms of civilization, many forms of civilization and the principal legal systems of the world. So perhaps we also can explore one step further, but that's really a message for states also to change our statute to include the gender dimension in the requirements for election to the ILC. So I'll stop with that and thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Patricia. And as you said, the number says it all. There's no need for any argument. And we look forward to the day where you will see the gender parity in the Law Commission. And you can count on us for support in the context of our work in the human rights system on gender parity. Thank you again. So our final panelist is Karin Jab, who is the Director of Program at the International Parliamentary Union. Our question to you, Karen. The IPU is a key actor promoting women's equal representation in political participation. How does the organization address the underrepresentation of women in key multilateral spaces? And what do you think are some of the good practices being implemented across the world at the national level that could inspire and promote gender balance in international decision-making? You have the floor.
Thank you very much. And again, it's a great pleasure to be here, and thank you to the organizers for including IPU in this debate. So let me just start by saying that for the IPU, gender equality is really at the core of our mission. And from the very beginning, we have associated democracy, genuine democracy, with participation of women and men in decision-making on an equal basis. So as was said here, it's a question of legitimacy. It's also a question of efficiency for parliaments to really deliver on their mandate and represent the needs and the interests of all of the components of society. There needs to be an equal representation of men and women in parliament so that you can really address all of those specificities and be effective. So the IPU has been working at two levels, at the level of supporting parliaments and change at the national level, but also within the organization itself, where we have taken many measures in order to include equal participation of women in our bodies and structures. 4 lessons learned I would like to focus on at the national level. First, you cannot change what you cannot see. So I think this is what we've all said, data really matters. IPU tracked or started to track participation of women in parliaments in the 1970s. And data is what allows you to see where are the gaps, where are the priorities, where is the progress, and what you need to focus on. So I think this is definitely one of the key lessons learned. The second lesson learned is building legal frameworks. You need a framework that really guides, sets targets, and really institutionalizes your objective. I think we've said it all as well, but it is important for this to be really clearly stated in one way or the other, and to have mechanisms that actually facilitate this objective. We've all referred to quotas. Just to give you one example, in 2022, if you look at the countries that elected women to parliament with quotas, they elected around 31% of women to parliaments. Those without quotas, 21%. So you have a 10-point difference between the two. But of course, you want quotas that are ambitious. You want to set your eye on parity, 50-50, and you need very strong implementation measures, sanctions, or else quotas will not be effective. The third point I'd like to mention is that numbers are not enough. You have women that can have access, but of course you need institutional reform and you need an institutional change as well. It is not and should not be the responsibility of women alone to defend gender equality. It's the responsibility of the institution to embody gender equality and to change the way it works and facilitate this inclusive decision making. So we've developed at the IPU this notion of gender sensitive parliaments. It's about parliaments changing the way they work, changing their hours, changing their structures, changing their culture so that women can have access to all decision makings within the parliament and contribute to the decisions taken by the parliaments themselves. And the fourth point is you need to also be careful or sensitive to the environment and the culture, and we've all said it as well, but one point I'd like to mention is the importance of sexism and sexual violence, especially for women in politics. 80% of the women MPs that we have interviewed have confirmed that they were subject to sexism and harassment. And of course, this is a major impediment to their full participation. Now, what do we do for the international level and at the IPU? I think we've been working on that also since the late 1980s, 1990s. We started by tracking numbers within the organization and reporting publicly on those within our membership. So it's a question of naming and shaming as well. I think you can play on that as well, and peer-to-peer pressure, that also works. But of course, that's not enough. And we put together a structure within the organization composed of 2 men and 2 women MPs at the highest level of the decision-making of our organization that are tasked to lead efforts to achieve gender equality within the IPU. It's what we call the Gender Partnership Group. This group has led efforts which have resulted in the adoption of quotas in all of the bodies bodies within the IPU. So we have a minimum of 33% representation of each gender in all of our governing bodies, and some bodies have 50%. We have sanctions for delegations that do not have men or women in their delegation, voting sanctions. You reduce the right to vote. And we have also mechanisms that monitor progress in terms of achievement and that also give a voice to women within the organization. I really would like to underline the importance of the partnership aspect, and the approach is one of gender equality, so it is about securing an equal representation for both sexes. That's the way we've gone through it. Anyway, just to conclude by saying, in terms of summing up some of the good practices, data, clear policy framework, partnerships with men, institutional reform, and constant monitoring. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Karen, for such clear, specific, practical, concrete points, which will be very useful for us. Before I give the floor to the ambassador for closing remarks, we have very, very few minutes because for outside events, we're very much constrained by the time. We must close by 1:30. So we have time for a couple of questions before I invite the ambassador to close the event for us. So now the floor is open for questions. If you just indicate to me so I could see. Okay, I have the OIC, and then after that, the gentleman in the back, you introduce yourself. Okay, so please take the floor. Be mindful of the time.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. بصفتي المدير التنفيذي للهيئة الدائمة المستقلة لحقوق الإنسان لمنظمة التعاون الإسلامي، وكأول امرأة تتولى إدارة ثاني أهم منظمة دولية على مستوى العالم، تضم 57 دولة من 3 مجموعات عربية وأسيوية وأفريقية، وأمثل 1 مليار امرأة في العالم الإسلامي.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. In my capacity as Executive Director of the Independent Permanent Human Rights Commission, the first woman to lead this body in one of the most important international organizations in the world, divided into 3 regional groups with 57 member states, including Arab group, African group, and ASEAN group. I do represent 1 billion women of the Islamic world.
وبالنيابة عن وفد الهيئة الدائمة المستقلة لحقوق الإنسان لمنظمة التعاون الإسلامي، أشكر المنظمين على إتاحة هذه الفرصة للمساهمة.
On behalf of the Independent Permanent Human Rights Commission and its delegation at this session, I would like to thank the organizers for the opportunity to contribute.
اعتمدت الهيئة منذ إنشائها حقوق المرأة كأحد مجالات عملها ذات الأولوية، كما اعتمدت منظمة التعاون الإسلامي إعلان القاهرة المنقح لمنظمة التعاون الإسلامي بشأن حقوق الإنسان.
Since its inception, the IPHRC has adopted women's rights as one of its priority areas of work. The Organization of Islamic Cooperation has also adopted the revised Cairo Declaration on Human Rights.
وقد ارتفع عدد النساء في عضوية الهيئة من 0 إلى ثلث أعضائها تقريباً. ارتفع عدد النساء.
And the women number in the commission has raised from 0 to 1/3 of membership.
ومؤخراً عقدت الهيئة ورشة عمل حول حق المرأة في التعليم، مكنت المشاركين من تبادل الآراء وتبادل أفضل الممارسات لتحسين وصول النساء والأطفال إلى التعليم وخاصة في أفغانستان.
Recently, the IPHRC organized a workshop on the women's right to education, and through that workshop, views were exchanged, best practices and recommendations related to women's and girls' access to education.
Excuse me, just one moment. We're extremely pleased that you're here and to see the progress that you're sharing with us. We have no time left. Yes. So if you have questions, then we can move on and to close the event because we will be kicked out of the room at 1:30.
I want to
Thank
see.
you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, and we're pleased to see you here and to share the progress that you made over the years from 0 to 1/3 of women in the Commission. Thank you very much. Now I pass the floor to the gentleman in the back. Please take the floor and very quickly, sorry.
It's not working. Yeah. Now it's clear? Yeah. Thank you very much. I'm Juan Ignacio Pérez Bello from International Disability Alliance, an alliance of 14 global and regional organizations of persons with disabilities. We work, of course, closely with the Committee on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities and other UN treaty bodies. I have first one comment, which is to thank the organizers and particularly the collaboration that we have had throughout the years with the colleagues from the GQUAL Secretariat. In the past, at the CPD committee, there was a situation in which there was one woman and 17 men as members of that committee. And thanks to the campaigning that we did jointly and the states receiving the message, this situation was reversed throughout time in the following elections. And secondly, I would like to consult to any of the panelists on the idea of aligning better, if feasible, on your thoughts on that, the calendars for instance, treaty body elections with the reality of the negotiation among states, either in Geneva or New York, for all the work that civil society does in order to give visibility and transparency and call for better assessment of candidates to take place in a timely manner and actually can have an impact on the decision that states will do when deciding on voting. Thank you very much for the time and congratulations.
Thank you for your intervention. Now, because of the time constraint, I will turn to Ambassador Villegas, who has been an ally and advocate for women's equal representation and participation in international human rights bodies, particularly during his time as the president of the Human Rights Council last year. Together with our UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, he's a member of the International Gender Champion and has committed to the pledges on panel parity and combating gender-based violence. Ambassador, thank you very much for being with us today. You have the floor.
Thank you. All protocol observed because we don't have time. Very briefly before they kick us from the room. The what, the why, and the how, very briefly. The what, we need a new social contract to accelerate equal representation and participation in international decision of women. And the when is now. We cannot wait. And just let me briefly conclude this important event with the why and the how. The why is because discrimination against women is the oldest, most massive, and most systematic violation of human rights. So if that is not something for us to accelerate, what else is? And why? Because it's ancestral, and also because it's a story of betrayal by men. We have to remember where we are today is because of the betrayal by men to women. Starting with the sapiens sapiens that were equal, both of them were sapiens sapiens. But at one point, one sapiens sapiens decided to exercise violence without any justification against the other one. And since then, we are still struggling for that. There was another huge betrayal, the French Revolution. We all know about it. If you heard the book of Lynn Hunt, if you haven't read it, read it, the invention of human rights. All the French revolutionaries that signed the Declaration of the Rights of Men and Citizens were inspired by the suffering of women characters in novels, and they developed this notion of empathy for the other human rights suffering. And look what they did. The first thing they did as men is to approve a Declaration of Human Rights without women. And of course, 1948 is a good start because we included all human beings. And then we had CEDAW, and then we had Beijing. But according to the discussions, just listening in this same building this week, it's not enough. Neither CEDAW nor Beijing, or we have to relaunch both of them. So, and the third why is the international action is key for the standards and the evolution of human rights law standards. So it's from Geneva that we set out what the world should at least consider as an evolution. The how, well, again, the problem of betrayal. The first how is men taking the right decisions, not women. Because one of the big problems, like Simone de Beauvoir said, is that discrimination against women is a men's problem. And second, only outstanding women are the ones that occupy positions of power. So it's a men's decision. So as president of the Human Rights Council, since I had very clear this, last year I appointed 70% of independent experts were women and 30% men. And I decided in 3 occasions to specifically do not follow the consultative group list because there were excellent candidates, the 3 of them, but number 1 were men and number 2 was an outstanding woman in 3 cases. And I felt that you cannot have, after 6 men holding the mandate of Special Rapporteur on Torture, which is one of the most important in history, 6 men to appoint another man being president, even though he was number 1, excellent academic. So I decided to appoint the first woman rapporteur on torture because there are many women in many jails around the world that suffer torture, and so it was about time. And the last thing is men's decision proposing women for important positions. I'm glad that in my country, not only we have an evolution in these issues and very progressive legislation, but today we have a president who is a man and a foreign minister who is a man. And both of them decided to propose women candidates for important positions. And thanks to the support of many countries here, we got them. So the first woman in 150 years to run the World Meteorological Organization, which is absolutely key for climate change. By the way, 80% of women are the most affected by climate change, is going to be a scientist from Argentina, Celeste Saulo. And first, we have another commissioner of human rights in the Inter-American Commission of Human Rights, and we have a judge, which is a woman also. So both are women. And we appointed a woman for the International Tribunal of the Law of the Sea. But it's men's deciding to put forward the men. And here, all of us, it's men also that have to make sure that when we elect international organizations, like the Geneva has changed dramatically in the last year. We have the first woman heading the World Trade Organization, the first woman heading the World Telecommunications Organization. We have the first woman now meteorological, the first woman heading UNCTAD, Rebecca Greenspan from Costa Rica, and the first woman heading the International Organization of Migration. My God. We are all the time talking about lip service on migrants and women migrants. So it's a men's problem to reach what we are trying to do. It's not only the feminist movement, for fairness and also for development, because, you know, I decided to become a feminist not because of my human rights approach, honestly, even though I have a long history. I decided to become a feminist when I understood that parity, equality, etc., is not only a women's issue, it's not only a human rights issue, it's a development issue. It's impossible for a country to approach the development if you don't incorporate fully half of your population. It's mathematics. And I learned from living in an African country where I was lucky to open the embassy and with extraordinary natural resources. And the president said, how can I develop all these resources if I have such a high rate of early marriage of girls? Instead of becoming engineers, they're forced to marry at 12 or 13. So I need engineers to develop those resources. And so it's a development issue, and I'm fully convinced. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ambassador, for this very precious concluding, insightful remarks, historical, cultural, personal, professional, and in the difference that you were able to make as a leader in the context of a Human Rights Council presidentship. So in conclusion, we are all in this together, men and women, to make the difference and to strive for equality in the end. So the time is short for the discussion, but we'll carry on outside of this event, and we'll continue the fight for equality. Thank you all, the panelists, all of the panelists and participants. Thank you so much. Have a good afternoon.